She didn't say goodbye when she left. She didn't look back. She just picked up her bag, unpinned her badge from her scrubs, and walked out of that hospital like a woman who already knew something the rest of the world was about to find out. And in a matter of hours, just a few short hours, the woman who had ordered her out of that room would be standing in a corridor, shaking, with tears streaming down her face, begging anyone who would listen to please, please bring her back. And this is the story of two women. One who held the power of money, status, and a last name that opened doors, and one who held something far more important, the kind of knowledge that only comes from years of sitting beside the sick, listening when others are too busy to hear, and reading the signals that the human body sends out like a desperate message before everything falls apart. One of those women was removed from a hospital room mid-shift because of a complaint. Hours later, and that room became a crisis scene, and the investigation that followed would shake that hospital to its foundation. Somewhere in America tonight, and I mean tonight, as you are watching this, there is a nurse sitting at a station, flagging something in a chart that a family member is calling an overreaction. There is a mother pressing a call button, demanding a different nurse, a better nurse, someone more agreeable, someone less alarming. And there is a system, a deeply flawed, a deeply human system, that will decide in that moment whether to stand behind the professional or accommodate the powerful. What happens next in that choice ripples outward in ways nobody can fully predict. This story is proof of that. Stay with me, because this one matters. Before we go any further, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Stories like this one don't get told enough. Let's make sure this one reaches everyone who needs to hear it. Her name was Margaret. Margaret Elaine Dawson. She was 47 years old, and she had been a registered nurse for 23 years. 11 of those years had been spent on the oncology floor of Mercy General Hospital, the kind of community hospital that the whole city orbits around, and the place where babies are born, and where people go at the hardest moments of their lives, and where everything in between gets sorted out by people like Margaret, who show up every single day regardless of what they are carrying at home. Margaret had 3 children, a son in college in Georgia, a daughter in high school, and a 12-year-old boy who was obsessed with basketball. She drove a sensible car. She owned a modest house on a street where everyone knew everyone. She made her coffee black every morning in a blue mug with a chip on the handle that she had never gotten around to replacing. These details matter, not because they are dramatic, because they are human. Before this story becomes a crisis, Margaret was simply a woman doing her job extraordinarily well, and we owe it to her to know that. In 11 years on the oncology floor, Margaret had developed the kind of clinical instinct that cannot be taught in a classroom, and it is the thing that happens when you spend thousands of hours beside the sick. When you have held the hands of patients who did not make it, and sat with families at 2 in the morning, and read enough charts to know when something on paper does not match what you are seeing in the room. Her colleagues described her as quiet but decisive. She did not make unnecessary conversation during rounds, but when she spoke, people listened. She had been named Nurse of the Quarter twice in 3 years. She mentored newer nurses with patience that was always mentioned in her performance reviews, and she had a reputation, a well-earned one, for catching things, for noticing small deviations in a patient's condition that others might dismiss as routine. That particular gift was about to become the center of everything. Her name was Patricia Holloway Grant. She was 56 years old, and she had built her entire identity around the concept of control. Her husband Ronald had passed 3 years earlier from a sudden cardiac event, an event that arrived without warning and stole from Patricia the one thing she had never had to negotiate for: certainty. Before Ronald died, Patricia had been the kind of woman who could walk into a room and reorganize it simply by entering. She was sharp. She was decisive. She was accustomed to outcomes going the way she directed them. And then the ambulance came for Ronald on a Thursday morning while he was getting dressed for work. And everything Patricia thought she knew about her authority over her own life dissolved in 45 minutes. After Ronald, Patricia redirected all of that grief, all of that desperate need for control, into her daughter. Ava was 22 years old. She was pre-law at a good university, sharp, driven, opinionated in the way that proud mothers secretly love, even when they publicly complain about it. When Ava began getting headaches in the fall of her junior year, Patricia told her it was stress. When the vision changes started, Patricia suggested she needed new glasses. When Ava fell in her campus apartment in November and her roommate called in a panic, Patricia drove 4 hours to get there and told Ava on the way to the emergency room that she was probably just overtired and that this was not going to derail her semester. Patricia's love for Ava was as vast and total as it is possible for one human being to love another. But it had been bent by loss, by fear, and by years of believing that if she managed every situation with enough force of will, she could keep the worst from happening. What Patricia could not afford to understand was that the worst had already started. It was moving quietly through her daughter's body, and a nurse named Margaret had already begun to see it. Ava Holloway Grant had been admitted to Mercy General on a Monday. The admitting diagnosis was listed as neurological workup pending, which, in hospital language, means we know something is wrong, but we do not yet know exactly what. The doctors knew that Ava had a history of recent falls, that she had been experiencing what she described as visual darkening at the edges of her field of vision, that her blood pressure readings over the past 2 weeks had been elevated in ways her college health clinic attributed to stress. Ava was cooperative and polite and did not make demands, but she was complicated in ways her chart could not fully capture. Because some of what Ava was experiencing, she was keeping to herself, not out of negligence, but because she had learned, on over 22 years, that when she told her mother something was frightening her mother responded with a plan to manage it, rather than a space to feel it. And so Ava had started doing what young adults do when they love someone who cannot sit still with fear. She had started keeping certain things quiet. She had already decided that the right person to hear them was a nurse. It was a Tuesday morning in March, the kind of morning that does not announce itself as significant. Gray sky outside, the smell of coffee from the nurse's break room, the low hum of monitors down the hall. Margaret had taken a handover from the night nurse at 7 a.m. sharp. The night nurse, a young woman named Dana, who had been on since 11 the previous evening, gave her a quick rundown of each patient on the floor. When she got to room 14, Ava Holloway Grant, Dana mentioned that the patient had been restless overnight, and had asked for water twice, had reported a mild headache around 3 in the morning that seemed to ease by 5. Blood pressure at the last check was 142/90. Elevated, but within the range that the overnight physician had noted without alarm. Dana handed it off and went home. Margaret stood at the nurse's station and opened Ava's chart. What Margaret saw when she pulled up that chart was not a crisis. Not yet. It was a pattern. And patterns are invisible to people who are looking for emergencies. They are visible to people who have spent years learning to read a patient the way a skilled reader reads between the lines. Not for what is said, but for what is accumulating. Margaret saw that Ava's blood pressure had been consistently elevated across 3 days. She saw that the headache complaints, while mild and intermittent, were occurring with increasing frequency. And she saw a note from the previous day referencing Ava's complaint of visual disturbance, passed to the attending physician, but not yet resulting in an updated care order. And she saw that Ava was 22 years old, with no prior history of high blood pressure, which made every one of those readings more significant, not less. Margaret made her own note in the chart at 7:28 that morning. She flagged the blood pressure trend. She documented the overnight headache. And she added a line that would later become the center of the hospital's internal review. Recommend physician reevaluation. Attention to possible neurological involvement. Will monitor closely pending rounds. At 7:45, Margaret went into room 14 to introduce herself and take Ava's morning vitals. What happened in that room in the next 20 minutes was witnessed only by the two of them. Ava pulled her close, not a whisper exactly, but a leaning in, and the particular closing of space that patients do when they have decided to trust someone and are afraid of being overheard. Ava told her that the visual episodes were getting worse, that the night before, around 2 in the morning, she had woken with a pressure behind her eyes so significant that she had genuinely been frightened. She had not pressed the call button. She had not told the night nurse, because she was afraid that if the information reached her mother would panic in a way that would make everything harder. And then Ava said something that Margaret committed to memory immediately, because it was exactly the kind of thing a nurse writes down somewhere she will not forget it. Ava said, "My mother thinks that if she manages everything hard enough, she can keep bad things from happening. But I can feel that something is wrong, and I need somebody to actually do something about it." Margaret promised Ava she would. She planned to speak personally with the attending physician during his morning rounds, which typically ran between 10 and 11. She had every intention of walking him through everything she had observed and everything Ava had just trusted her with. She went directly to the nursing station and made her 7:28 notes. She flagged it as a priority. And then, at 8:05, Patricia Holloway Grant walked into room 14. And Patricia had arrived at the hospital every morning at almost exactly the same time. The nurses knew her footsteps before they saw her face. She was well-dressed, moved with authority, and made it quietly but unmistakably clear from the first day of Ava's admission that she expected a high standard of attention. She had already filed complaints about 2 nurses earlier in the week, one for what she described as an insufficient explanation of a test result, and one for what she called a dismissive tone during a family update. When she arrived that Tuesday morning and found Margaret finishing Ava's assessment, something in the interaction unsettled her. She would later describe it as Margaret alarming her daughter. What she had actually witnessed was a targeted neurological assessment, a nurse asking specific structured questions about vision, headache severity, pressure distribution behind the eyes. And these are not questions designed to frighten a patient. They are questions designed to locate a problem before it announces itself in a way that is far harder to manage. Patricia waited until Margaret came out of the room, then followed her to the nurse's station. The conversation that followed was documented in the incident report the charge nurse filed shortly after. The exact words are not publicly available, but the substance is not in dispute. Patricia told Margaret that she felt her daughter was being made unnecessarily anxious. She used the word catastrophizing. She said the family had already spoken with the attending physician and that he had not expressed significant concern. She said she wanted a different nurse for the remainder of Ava's admission. And then she said something that the charge nurse, who was within earshot, included in her written account. Patricia said, "I know how this hospital works, and I have donated to this foundation for 15 years. I expect this to be handled appropriately." Margaret did not raise her voice. Every account of that morning agrees on this. She responded calmly, professionally, and without hostility. She told Patricia that her concerns about Ava's symptoms were clinically based and had been documented through the appropriate channels. She said she understood if the family preferred a different nurse, but that she wanted to make sure the incoming nurse was fully briefed on everything she had observed that morning. Then she walked away. Within 20 minutes, the charge nurse had received Patricia's formal complaint. Within 40, the decision had been made. By 9:03 in the morning, Margaret had been removed from Ava's case. Her badge still worked. Her job was still hers, but she would not be going back into room 14. A junior nurse named Kayla, 2 months into her role on this particular floor, was assigned in her place. Here is something that the general public rarely thinks about and that healthcare professionals think about constantly. When a nurse is removed from a patient's care mid-shift, for any reason at all, there is a transfer of information that must happen. The incoming nurse is supposed to receive a complete briefing: the patient's history, current status, any flags in the chart, pending physician reviews, any recent conversations with the patient that might be clinically relevant. This process is called handover. In a healthy system, it is thorough, documented, and treated with the seriousness it deserves. But a handover conducted under pressure, a handover that happens because someone has been complaining out of a room, mid-morning, with a floor full of other patients all needing attention, is the kind of handover that leaves gaps. Not because people are careless, but because the gap is invisible until something falls through it. Kayla was not a bad nurse. This point was made repeatedly in the weeks that followed, and it cannot be made strongly enough. She was diligent, earnest, and genuinely committed to her patients. But she was 2 months into her first real assignment on an oncology floor, and she had not yet developed the clinical intuition that comes with years of experience. When she received the handover from Margaret, brief, rushed, to conduct it in the hallway outside room 14, while Patricia was already back inside with Ava, she was given the basic facts: blood pressure trends, current medications, the overnight headache complaint. What she was not given, because there was not enough time, and because the handover was not structured the way the hospital's own protocols required, was the full picture of what Margaret had been watching build across 3 days. Margaret's 7:28 note was in the chart, and it was documented. But documentation only protects a patient if someone reads it carefully and understands what they are looking at. And Kayla, new to this floor, new to these kinds of patients, did not yet know what she was seeing. For almost 3 hours after Margaret left, room 14 was quiet. Patricia sat beside Ava's bed, and they talked about Ava's upcoming moot court competition. They watched a little television. Patricia bought Ava a smoothie from the hospital cafe and fussed over whether the cup was big enough. These are the things mothers do in hospital rooms when they are terrified and trying to make everything feel normal. Kayla checked in at the scheduled intervals, took vitals, documented what she found, and did what she had been trained to do. Ava's blood pressure at 11 a.m. was 148/94. Elevated, but not dramatically different from what the chart had been showing. At 11:45, Ava reported a headache. Kayla offered the pain medication that had been prescribed as needed. Ava took it. Kayla documented the complaint and moved on to her other patients. Nobody called the physician. Nobody compared that reading to the trend Margaret had flagged. And the clock kept moving. At 12:17 in the afternoon, Ava's monitor alarmed. The alarm that goes off in a hospital room is not subtle. When a patient's oxygen saturation drops the way Ava's did in those minutes, the sound cuts through every other noise on the floor, and the response is immediate. Kayla heard it from another room. The charge nurse heard it. The code team was called before anyone fully understood what was happening. What they found when they reached room 14 was a young woman whose body had decided that it had been compensating for long enough and was done doing so quietly. Or the crisis that Margaret had seen building in the numbers, the one she had flagged, the one she had tried to escalate, the one she had promised Ava she would not let slip through, had arrived. And Margaret was at home. Patricia was moved into the hallway by a nurse who held her firmly by both shoulders and spoke directly into her face. "We are helping her. We need the room. Please wait here." Patricia did not make a sound. She pressed herself against the wall of the corridor and put both hands over her mouth, and every bit of control she had spent 56 years building dissolved completely. She did not move. She did not demand anything. She did not reach for her phone, or invoke the foundation, or use the last name that opened doors. She just stood there in the hallway of Mercy General Hospital, and she waited, because there was nothing else left to do. It took 11 minutes to stabilize Ava. 11 minutes is not a long time in most contexts. In a hospital corridor, when your child is on the other side of a door, and you can hear voices raised in urgency and the sounds of equipment and the focused chaos of people fighting for someone's life. 11 minutes is close to unbearable. At 12:28, the lead physician came into the hallway and told Patricia that Ava was stable, that her blood pressure had spiked to dangerous levels, a hypertensive crisis, they would confirm shortly after, and that her brain had been under significant pressure, which had caused the sudden deterioration, that they had it under control now, that Ava was awake and asking for her mother. Patricia went into that room, sat beside her daughter, took her hand, and did not let go for 2 hours. What she did not know yet, what nobody had told her yet, was that what had just happened to Ava had been documented as a risk 3 days earlier, in a note, by a nurse named Margaret, the nurse she had removed that morning. In the hours following Ava's stabilization, the attending physician went back through her chart with the kind of attention that crises tend to generate after the fact. It is a painful irony of medicine that the full story of a patient's decline is often most clearly visible in retrospect, when the sequence of events can be laid out in order, and the logic of what happened becomes undeniable. What the physician found when he reviewed the chart that Tuesday afternoon was Margaret's note from 7:28 that morning. He read it once. Then he read it again. Then he called the charge nurse into his office and closed the door. The note was specific, clinically sound, and, in the context of what had happened 6 hours later, almost exactly predictive of the crisis that had unfolded. Margaret had flagged the blood pressure trend. She had noted the increasing frequency of headache complaints. She had documented Ava's self-reported visual disturbance. And she had written, in clear professional language, that she was recommending physician reevaluation with attention to possible neurological involvement. That recommendation had been made at 7:28 in the morning. The physician had not been explicitly contacted about it, and it had been documented but not escalated in the way that a flag of that seriousness arguably required. And by 9:03, the nurse who wrote it was no longer on the case. The physician sat with that information for a long time before he picked up the phone, because what he was looking at was not just a medical event, it was a sequence, and sequences, in hospitals, are the province of investigations. A Mercy General's patient safety team opened a formal internal review within 24 hours of Ava's crisis. At its center was a complaint filed by a family member, acted upon by hospital administration within 40 minutes, and linked by an undeniable timeline to the removal of the most experienced nurse on the floor from the care of a patient who subsequently deteriorated in precisely the way that nurse had specifically flagged. Hospital administrators are careful, unmeasured people during an active review. Nobody pointed a finger on record. But behind the closed doors of that process, the questions being asked were direct, and some of them did not have comfortable answers. The charge nurse was interviewed first. She was cooperative. She explained that Patricia Holloway Grant's complaint had been formal, emphatic, and accompanied by references to the family's long relationship with the hospital foundation. She explained that accommodating family requests for nurse reassignments was considered standard practice, part of patient and family experience management. She acknowledged that the handover between Margaret and Kayla had been briefer than it should have been. She acknowledged that she had not reviewed Margaret's 728 chart note before approving the transfer. She said, with visible distress, that in retrospect, she wished she had. The floor manager gave a consistent account, and he had received a call from administration. He had supported the decision. He had not reviewed the chart before approving the transfer. Two different people. The same sequence of events. The same painful conclusion at the end of both of their accounts. The story reached the community the way stories in small enough cities always do. And the public reaction was the fractured, emotional, deeply human response that these situations always produce. There were people, nurses, healthcare workers, and anyone who had spent time in a hospital system who recognized the pattern immediately and were furious about it. They knew what it meant when an experienced, attentive caregiver is removed mid-shift because a family member with money decides that their discomfort with being told the truth outweighs the truth itself. These people were not quiet. And then there were others who saw a mother in a hospital room, terrified for her child, undoing the only thing she knew how to do: assert control in a situation where she felt she had none. People who had sat in those rooms themselves. People who said she had the right to request a different nurse. She was not a criminal. She was a mother. Both of those things were true at the same time, and that is what made the story so difficult to hold. While all of this unfolded at Mercy General, Margaret was at home, and she had learned what happened from a single text message sent by a former colleague at 1:47 in the afternoon. "Your patient coded. She's okay. Are you?" Margaret sat at her kitchen table for a long time after reading that. Her first feeling was not grief or anger, but something quieter than both. A specific, exhausted sadness she recognized. The kind that comes when you have already seen something coming, and were not allowed to stay to meet it. So she thought about her 728 note. She thought about Kayla, who she hoped was not blaming herself. She thought about Ava, about the 20 minutes they had spent together that morning before Patricia arrived, about the promise she had made and had not had the chance to keep. She sat in her backyard and tried to read a book and could not read a single page. And then she went inside and waited, because she already knew the hospital would call. They called the following morning, and the patient advocate asked if Margaret would be willing to be interviewed as part of the internal review. Margaret said yes, without hesitation. The interview lasted 3 hours. The patient advocate who conducted it described it afterward as one of the most detailed and emotionally precise accounts she had received in 15 years of that work. Margaret spoke without notes. She walked the investigator through every minute of her morning in room 14, the vitals, the chart review, to the specific questions she had asked Ava during her assessment, the specific answers she had received. And then she came to the 7 minutes she had spent alone with Ava before Patricia walked through the door. Ava had told her that the visual episodes were worsening, that the night before, around 2 in the morning, she had woken up with a pressure behind her eyes so significant that she had been genuinely frightened. She had not pressed the call button. She had not told the night nurse, and because she was afraid that if the information reached her mother, it would make everything harder. And then Ava had said the thing that Margaret had carried with her since that morning. She had said, "My mother thinks if she manages everything hard enough, she can keep bad things from happening. But I can feel that something is wrong, and I need somebody to actually do something about it." Margaret had promised her. So she had gone to the nursing station and made her note and prepared to catch the physician at rounds. And then she walked off the floor, and the attending had arrived at 10:15, and Kayla was managing 5 patients, and the note sat in the chart, untouched, unescalated, waiting for someone to read it who understood what it meant. The review board issued its findings 6 weeks after Ava's crisis. They were not released publicly in full, as hospital review documents rarely are. But the broad conclusions became known through multiple people involved in the process. The board found that Margaret's clinical documentation had been thorough, appropriate, and accurate in every respect. It found that while Patricia Holloway Grant's complaint represented a legal use of the hospital's grievance process, and it had been accommodated in a manner that violated the hospital's own protocols for mid-shift nurse transfers, protocols that required a full chart review by the charge nurse before any transfer was approved, and a structured handover that included verbal confirmation from the incoming nurse that all critical flags had been understood. Neither requirement had been met, and the board found that the gap in information continuity created by the transfer had reduced the probability of timely physician intervention in Ava's deteriorating status. It stopped short of stating that the transfer caused Ava's crisis, because Ava's crisis was the result of an underlying medical condition that existed independently of anything anyone in that hospital did. But it stated clearly, in language that was institutional and careful and devastating nonetheless, that the outcome of that crisis could have been different, that the window for earlier intervention had existed, and that the nurse who identified that window had been removed before she could use it. The charge nurse received a formal disciplinary notation. The floor manager was placed on a performance improvement plan. The hospital's protocols for mid-shift nurse transfers were rewritten entirely, and Margaret, who had violated nothing, documented everything, and done every single thing correctly, received a formal written apology from the hospital's chief nursing officer. She accepted it. She was also offered a settlement. She accepted that too. And then she went back to work. Patricia Holloway Grant was never disciplined. She had filed a complaint through a formal channel, a legal act, an act that exists for good reasons, and that in different circumstances might have led to genuinely important corrective action. And the system did not fail because she used it. The system failed because the people responsible for operating it weighed a wealthy donor's discomfort against a documented clinical concern and made the wrong call in 40 minutes. Patricia would carry her role in that sequence of events without any legal or institutional accounting. And if you have ever watched someone carry that kind of weight, the weight of knowing that a decision you made set a chain of events in motion that nearly cost you everything, you understand that it is not a light thing to live with. Patricia visited the hospital chaplain 3 times in the weeks that followed. She asked the chaplain whether what had happened was her fault. The chaplain told her that fault was a word that belonged in courtrooms. and that what she seemed to be asking about was something larger than that. Patricia did not speak publicly about any of it. She did not give interviews. She sat with what had happened in the private silence of someone who is used to commanding rooms and has suddenly lost the ability to speak into the one that matters most. About 10 days after Ava was discharged, Patricia asked to speak with Margaret. The meeting was arranged through the patient advocate's office, and Margaret did not have to agree to it. She was under no professional or personal obligation to sit in a room with the woman who had complained about her out of a patient's care on the morning that patient nearly died. Margaret agreed anyway. She said later that she agreed because she believed it would be useful to Ava, not to Patricia, not to herself, to Ava. They met in a small conference room at the hospital, the kind of room kept for difficult conversations, but with softer chairs than the waiting rooms and a box of tissues on the table that everyone pretends not to notice. No witnesses, no mediators, no attorneys, just two women and the weight of what had passed between them. What Patricia said in that room has never been fully disclosed. What both women have confirmed, through separate conversations with people they trusted, is that Patricia apologized, that it was not brief or perfunctory, that it took time, and that some of it was halting in the way that real apologies always are when the person making them has genuinely understood the weight of what they are apologizing for. And what Margaret said in response, the thing that stayed with everyone who heard about it, was this: "I know you love her. I could see it in every decision you made, even the ones that made my job harder. What I need you to understand is that I was on her side, too." The day after that meeting, Ava Holloway Grant submitted a handwritten request through the hospital's patient services office. She was still inpatient at that point. Her treatment had extended her stay by nearly 2 weeks. Her request was simple. She asked whether Margaret Dawson could be part of her care team for the remainder of her admission. She specified that this was her own request, independent of her mother's wishes, and that she had the cognitive capacity to make her own health care decisions, and was doing so clearly and of her own free will. It was, in its way, a quietly extraordinary document. A 22-year-old in a hospital bed, in the middle of a frightening chapter of her life, asserting with complete composure that she had the right to choose who stood in her corner. The hospital honored the request. Margaret was asked if she was willing. She said she would think about it overnight, and the next morning she called and said yes. When Margaret walked back into Ava's room, Ava looked at her and said the thing that Margaret has said she will carry for the rest of her life. She said, "I told my mom everything. Everything I told you. I told her last night. About being scared. About not wanting her to panic. All of it." And then she said, "I think she heard me this time." Margaret sat down in the chair beside the bed, and they talked for a long time. Not about vitals. Not about charts or blood pressure trends or pending physician reviews. Just about Ava. About her plans after graduation. About what she wanted her life to look like. About everything that had been put on hold while this was happening. Patricia was not in the room that morning. And for the first time in what felt like a very long time, that was exactly the right arrangement. People have asked Margaret, in the time since this story became known, whether she regrets going back, whether there is something performatively noble about returning to care for the patient of the woman who had her removed, and whether that performance served her or quietly cost her something. These are not comfortable questions, and Margaret does not give comfortable answers. She says she did not go back for Patricia. She did not go back to prove a point, or be the bigger person in any way that anyone else would see and applaud. She went back because Ava had trusted her. And in the kind of nursing Margaret had practiced for 23 years, the relationship with a patient does not end because someone with more money and more anger and more fear decided it should. She went back because it was the right thing to do for the patient. And she says, if you are looking for a more complicated reason than that, you are looking for something that is not there. And what happened to Ava medically is this. She was diagnosed with a secondary hypertension condition linked to a renal abnormality that had likely been present and undetected for several years. It was treatable. She was discharged after 26 days in the hospital with a medication plan and a follow-up schedule and instructions to rest. She returned to university the following semester. She has since graduated. She has, by all accounts, a complicated and evolving relationship with her mother. The kind built on a crisis survived together, and on the honest conversations that only a crisis can sometimes open up. And she has, by her own account, never forgotten what it meant to have someone in a hospital room who was actually paying attention. This story is not unique. That is the hardest thing to sit with when it is over. The specific details belong to these particular people, to Margaret, to Patricia, to Ava, to Mercy General on a gray Tuesday in March. But the structure of what happened is not rare. Healthcare systems across the United States are navigating this exact tension every single day, between the legitimate needs and rights of patients and their families, and the professional authority and clinical judgment of the nurses who care for them. Research from nursing safety organizations and hospital accreditation bodies has consistently identified mid-shift care disruptions, including nurse reassignments driven by family complaints, as an under-examined risk factor in patient safety, particularly when the outgoing nurse has flagged concerns that have not yet been acted upon by the medical team. The gap is not dramatic, it is not always visible, but it is real. And when it closes around the wrong patient, at the wrong moment, and the consequences are exactly as serious as they were in room 14. There is a principle in what healthcare professionals call just culture, a framework for understanding error and accountability in medical settings that distinguishes between individual failure and systemic failure. The goal, under that framework, is not to find someone to blame. The goal is to find the place where the system lets the patient down, and to change it. At Mercy General, they found it. They rewrote the protocols, and they created new handover requirements. They built a process for reviewing clinical documentation before any mid-shift transfer could be approved. They did the work. And somewhere in a hospital right now, somewhere a nurse has just flagged something in a chart, and a family member is asking for someone more agreeable. Those protocols are either there, or they are not. It matters enormously which one it is. Margaret is still a nurse. She works on the same floor. Some things about how that floor operates are different now because of what happened in room 14. Patricia renewed her donation to the hospital foundation that year, quietly, with a note attached that nobody outside the development office ever read. And Ava is living her life, which is all any of us can ultimately ask for. There was no villain in this story. There was a system under pressure. A mother driven by love and terror. A nurse doing her job with extraordinary precision. And a young woman who knew something was wrong and needed someone to hear her. One person heard her. It almost was not enough. And that is the thing that should stay with you long after this ends. Now I want to ask you something directly, and I mean this genuinely. Think about it, and leave your answer in the comments below. If you were Margaret, if you had done everything right, documented everything, flagged everything, been removed anyway, and then came home to learn that the patient you had been watching deteriorated exactly the way you expected, would you have gone back when they asked? Would you have walked back into that room? And if you would, what would have made you do it? There is no wrong answer here, but there is a real one. And the conversation it starts is one worth having. If this story moved you, if it made you angry, or sad, or grateful, or quietly changed the way you think about what happens inside hospital rooms, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Share it with every nurse you know, because they give more of themselves than most of us will ever fully understand. Share it with anyone who has ever sat in a hospital waiting room feeling completely powerless. And if you have not already, please subscribe to Behind the Lie, because the story we have coming next starts with a family photograph, a DNA test, and a secret that stayed buried for 23 years. You will not see where it goes, but once it starts, you will not be able to stop. This is Behind the Lie, and we will see you in the next one.